Ready?
Okay.
Ruth, let's start at the very beginning and talk about little Ruth Ashton Taylor, who wasn't little Ruth Ashton Taylor at that time.
No.
What was her name?
That's hard to remember. The little Ruth was Ruth Montoya, born to Flora and Julian Montoya. And my father is Spanish. My parents were separated and divorced when I was 4, though, so my mother decided to take her maiden name back, and I didn't think that was fair, so in school I just started to write my name as Ashton rather than Montoya at a certain point. In fact, I think it was in the 3rd grade when I finally came to this realization that my mother was going by a different name from mine. So little Ruth Montoya suddenly dropped out of school, and a little girl named Ruth Ashton suddenly took her seat in school writing that on her papers. That's the only way I've ever changed my name. I became Ruth Ashton, which was my mother's maiden name, Ashton was, without anybody ever knowing a thing about it. And it did cause some confusion from time to time, but it was my decision, and that's
Been
the way
with
it
you
was.
ever since.
That's right.
Now, that was in about the 3rd grade, and you were going to school where?
I was going to school in Long Beach, California, Burnett Elementary School.
Where you were born in Southern California.
I was born in Long Beach,
right.
raised in Long Beach.
And your mother was working the whole time, just about?
My mother was a housewife up until the time she got a divorce, and then it was not a friendly divorce, and my father sort of just dropped out of the picture. My mother had to support me, and did by working. Ultimately, she got a little restaurant that had a house attached to it so that she could have me by her, near her, because I wasn't a real healthy kid, and I got less healthy when I was being sort of shipped around from relative to relative. One aunt particularly who could bake wonderful cakes, and she'd feed me Jell-O and whipped cream and cake, and she made me fat, but it made me sick. But that was an example of some of the types of things that happen to a little child who has just kind of been put wherever she could be put while a mother works. Mother finally did find this arrangement that worked out fine, and was the arrangement she had, which was she ran this little restaurant, and the house was just out the back door and on the corner of the lot. And that's where I grew up from, oh, for goodness sakes, from the time I was about 6 or 7. And she still lived there when I went on to college. After college, I went on to Columbia, and while I was in New York, Mother finally sold the little restaurant.
What was it like being a child next to a restaurant in an emerging metropolis like Los Angeles at that time?
I was not in Los Angeles. I was in an even more dangerous place. I was in Signal Hill.
Which, for people who don't know where it
And
is.
Signal Hill was a hill in the middle of Long Beach. In fact, it became incorporated and was for a long time the only little incorporated town within a city within a city. Signal Hill was where great oil discoveries were made, and it used to be quite a sight because there were the big derricks that they had always, with even through the pumping stage in those days. So that Signal Hill was just crowded with oil derricks, and all around it were all of the different kinds of businesses that fed into the oil business, lumber business, oil tools business, all kinds of things. But that was Signal Hill, was the oil business. And so you had all those wonderful things. Kids would go out, and our fun would be maybe trying to walk on rotary mud, which is a little like quicksand, or climbing up old deserted oil derricks, things that don't contribute to long lives sometimes. It was, and I've, in commenting, sometimes said I may be the only person who was ever raised in Signal Hill that you know and lived. But it was right in the middle of the oil business, which was part of where my mother, a great part of where my mother drew her customers from. And also in that group were employers for me while I was growing up. I worked for a lumber company from the time I was 11, and I worked for an oil company, and I worked for a construction company. And those were things that I got to do. These were all people who were like our friends. It was very much of a man's world, which was interesting because though my father was gone, I was surrounded by men all my life, which some have actually said was possibly contributing to what happened to me later in life as I became a journalist in a man's world, because it was not at all a foreign kind of situation for me.
Now, what jobs were you doing when you were 11 or 12 years old?
When I was 11,
early jobs.
I started answering phones, and then I started typing invoices. Then I started keeping books. And by the time I was, 12, 13, I was doing their invoices and sending them out and keeping the books. And I, as a matter of fact, I majored in math in high school and was always very good at it. And I cultivated the craft of bookkeeping to the extent that I was asked to come and straighten out books when I was 16 and 17, which was fine. It has helped me. When I was with CBS in the early days in New York, I did a lot of plain old ordinary math work and figuring things up at conventions and election nights and things like that. It's just been a little sort of side thing of mine. I don't talk about much.
So here you are in what is a growing community?
Well, Signal Hill had only so far to grow. It was packed with oil derricks and quite a sight. And it didn't grow. It finally, ultimately, shut down little by little, but not while we were there. I used to think a great, beautiful sight was the moon coming up back of an oil derrick. I mean, that was, and it was. It was very pretty.
Very picturesque.
But it wasn't growing. Long Beach grew, and Long Beach was the main city. And Signal Hill just was this confined little town within Long Beach where there was a good deal of, as I look back on it, I'm sure there was a great deal, I know there was a great deal of corruption. There was a lot of money there. There was, this liquid gold was coming out of the ground as fast as anybody would ever want it. One little oil well in your backyard and you were in good shape. My mother profited by the fact that she was in the right place for customers, but unfortunately they didn't find oil in our backyard.
Yeah. And that was called, your mother's place was called
Sis's Cafe.
And it has kind of a reputation, or grew kind of a reputation of being a hangout for people coming from Hollywood as they went through, and some political types I know dropped by, you said.
Clark Gable came by, the governor of Massachusetts, Governor Saltonstall, because I went to school at Scripps with his daughter. And he came by, and actually it was known and has subsequently been known as it's kind of become legendary as a place where many important oil deals were made and big corporate deals. Corporations were not the same as they are now. I mean, Texaco was Texaco, Ridgefield was Ridgefield. Ridgefield has a bad name with me because they had a refinery only a few blocks from us that blew up once, and that took care of our house pretty well for a while. But
it wasn't a real fancy place, though. It was a true cafe, wasn't it?
It was a little cafe with a long kind of horseshoe counter, and everybody sat at the counter. Everything was homemade, and my mother was an excellent cook, and she had excellent cooks who worked for her. And so she made a good success of it. She was a good personality, and that was important because you had to kind of just bat the repartee back and forth with the different people who came in there, and Mother was good at that. And she was also good at her numbers, so that she was able to do pretty well. But let's face it, that was a period that went through the Depression as well, so it was very hard. It was very hard for a single mother, too. And she worked very, very long hours. And I suppose I learned quite a lot about the ethic of work because that was right in front of me all the time.
Now, it's pretty simple circumstances to then head from there to Scripps College. So
Well,
how did
I
that
did well
happen?
in school. For some reason, it was like I just had a drive, an energetic drive, because I was in lots of activities. I also got straight A's, and I didn't plan to go to a major college or university. I planned to go where all my friends were going, which was Long Beach Junior College, because that's where you're going to have a lot more fun. But an advisor at Poly High, who knew my record, suggested that that was not a good idea, that I should apply for scholarships, because we were not in a position financially to think of going to major institutions. He certainly was relatively little amount of money compared to what it is in the 90s to send a child to a college or university, but it was big if you didn't have much money, and we didn't have much money. So and I hadn't aimed at it at all. It was this Dr. Adams in Long Beach Poly High who said, you can't go to junior college, that's all. So we applied to Scripps and Stanford, places that sounded kind of groovy. And I was accepted in both of them with a scholarship. So I chose, though, to go to Scripps because it was closer to home. And I had a very good scholarship. And they also provided for me to work so that I could work and had the scholarship. And we were able to swing 4 years at Scripps College.
And you lived on campus?
Yes, that's the way that's the way the college is set up. There are dormitories and halls on campus, and everybody, I don't know, there may be a handful of people who don't live on campus. And of course, Scripps College is in the little town of Claremont, California, where you have Pomona College and Harvey Mudd College and Pitzer College. What else? You have Claremont Graduate School. Anyway, it's a little complex. It's sort of on the Oxford plan, and you can go to all of those colleges to take classes if you want to. So there weren't that many colleges when I went there. Pomona College and Scripps and Claremont College were the colleges when I went to school there. Made it very difficult because there were not enough men at Pomona to go around. So
Scripps
is all women.
all women.
Still is all women.
Mm-hmm.
And that had a lot of advantages and some disadvantages. You had to look to Caltech, which was 26 miles away, which we did, and they looked our way because they were a male college at that time. So we had a good social life, too.
How'd you get involved in journalism?
By accident. I still liked extracurricular activities and doing things, and somebody just asked me if I would be circulation manager for the school paper at Scripps, which was called The Scripture. And so that was fine. I did that. That was a little job, and I did other little things, I guess. But and stayed working for the paper in this sort of minor way. And then the editor's position was an elective position at Scripps, and some people didn't like the person who was running for editor, so they decided to put me up for editor when I was a junior, as a matter of fact. So not because I was going to be any good. It was because they didn't want this other girl. It was a political backroom deal. And I won and became editor of a college newspaper, which I expanded and wrote a great deal of what we had in it. I expanded it to the outside world. Scripps College was sort of an ivory tower, and I took in more news from the outside, which became controversial, so we played controversy in the paper too. Ultimately, I was kind of fairly well known for what I had done with the paper, and some of my professors when I graduated from college, one particularly, urged me to go into journalism.
But you didn't have any formal training in journalism per se
No,
at Scripps?
not at Scripps. Scripps, it was all strictly practical experience. Scripps was a liberal arts, is a liberal arts college, and they didn't specialize in the professions or crafts of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
So that's to go into journalism, you could go, and I did go, walked in the city room of the Los Angeles Times, which was a hostile environment at that time.
Why do you say hostile?
Well, a woman walks in at that point in the 40s into the Los Angeles Times city room, and she obviously has made a mistake and come through the wrong door. You know, she should go over in family, which they call the, what now is the view section for the Los Angeles Times, was called family, and that's where a woman belonged. You could clean glue pots, maybe, or something like that. But an opportunity for a woman, and I'm sure others have different stories, but the opportunities that could be seen by the professor who was particularly advising me and by me was that the best avenue was to go to a top-notch school of journalism and get a master's degree and go into journalism that way. And that's what I did.
And was this the advisor who helped you get there, helped you?
No, he
Gave
was
you
simply, when I
recommendations?
said, what am I going to do? And I went back after I'd graduated from Scripps. The war was on at that point. I was totally useless as far as the war was concerned, but everybody wanted to do something. I mean, you wanted to do something. I started out saying I was not very healthy. Well, I still wasn't a picture of health. I was always kind of a scrawny person, so that I didn't weigh enough to give blood even to the Red Cross. And I was rejected, though we had people from the Waves and the other services as for women on campus to try to recruit women into the armed services during World War II. I didn't qualify for any of them physically, which was, you know, I really was kind of a wreck. But I could go on into journalism. But I wanted to do something I thought would have some significance. Now, in light of some of the things that have happened in the modern time, people would say, and you went into journalism with that philosophy? Yes, I felt it was and still do, a profession in which you can try anyway to do some things that may have some positive results. And anyway, my professor suggested that I should just choose the best school I could. And after I'd had my conversation with him, we decided that Columbia was the best. And the first thing I did was go down before I even applied, because it was wartime. It was hard to get transportation. Went down and got a ticket on a train to New York, and then I applied to Columbia and applied for a scholarship. And they didn't give scholarships the first semester. I managed to borrow money to go the first semester, and then I got a scholarship for the second semester.
So did you go to New York and then apply, or did you apply from LA?
No. You had to make reservations a long time in advance. And I found out when school would be starting and when I had to have a reservation to go to New York. I made the reservation and applied sort of right about the same time.
So you were pretty certain about your ability to get in, do you think?
Well, yeah. At that stage in my life, I didn't have nearly as many doubts as I would have if I'd been a realist. But it is a time, I think, when a lot of young people feel that they can do almost anything they set their mind on if they try hard enough. But one of the things that my mom and my experience in growing up had sort of put into my head was that I could do just about anything if I tried hard enough. And so, okay, give another little spurt there and you'll do it. So
you didn't apply anywhere else. You just applied.
Take a break there.
Go ahead. Tell me when.
No, I'm sure. This one is up. So, okay.
Tell me what New York City was like when you arrived there. And had you ever traveled very widely before you got there?
No.
No.
No. I traveled in Southern California and New Los Angeles, Signal Hill, Long Beach, Arrowhead, but I was not very cosmopolitan. No, I'd also traveled to the Midwest where my grandparents were and quite a lot. So I traveled around in the Middle West a lot I said, so I can't contradict that. But I had never been east, and New York City, of course, was awesome, totally awesome. I also, the trip by train, because that's the way I went across the country, was fascinating to me. And I think it would be fascinating to anybody still to go across this country by train and look at the change, so you know when you're in Nebraska, you know when you're in Missouri, you know when you're in Illinois. There is a change. It has a character as you travel across. And for somebody who hadn't traveled, this was just exciting to me. Looking was an activity. And then, of course, to go to New York, which was this fabulous city, totally different from what it is now. New York was fresh. Everything was fresh and exciting and was going on. It was happening. And it was, I know it wasn't safe in the way that there was no crime, but it certainly, it was so much safer that you would hop on a subway any time of night and not feel threatened, and that was a valid feeling. It was also a wonderful place to go to school if you're in journalism, because it was a great laboratory. Everything went on there. The arts, of course, had their centers there. You had dynamism in your labor activities, and in your politics you had some real great crooks in politics up in there. And it was exciting to go to the School of Journalism because we were actively writing, reporting, working in journalism as we were students, along with the academic part of it, which would be history of journalism, law of libel, all those things that you did. Also, your professors, all of the faculty had experience, first-hand experience in a major way, and now I'd come on to the faculty, full-time faculty, or they were in there for temporary assignments, and they would be coming from working actively at that time in the New York Times, at that time New York Herald Tribune, all the other papers, publishers. My professor of radio journalism was Paul White, head of CBS News. The first semester professor of journalism was Phil Newsom, head of United Press Radio News. So it was where it was, New York was, and so I was excited, and that was a good way to be. I mean, a student, you weren't afraid, you were excited, you were stimulated. It was a tremendous amount going on. The war was on, and of course you had that terrible feeling of urgency and depression about what was going on in the bigger scene. But for students working day to day in their milieu, you were, it was a magnificent experience.
Did you live near the school? Did you commute?
When I went to school, I lived at the Teachers College dormitory, which was on a corner of the campus. And later, when I happened to end up at 116th Street, 116th and Broadway is where School of Journalism was, Pulitzer School, Columbia. Pulitzer, too, and not Pulitzer, which people. But at any rate, 116th and Broadway is where the school was located. I ultimately moved back with some friends from Scripps into a wonderful apartment house at the corner of 116th and Riverside Drive, which was just a block away, because it was a great environment at that time. And Grant's tomb was nearby, Riverside Church.
Who's buried in Grant's tomb?
I forgot.
So you're graduating, getting close to graduation, and you got to look for work. So what happens?
No, I actually was offered 2 jobs. I was offered a job by United Press, and I was offered a job by Paul White at CBS News when I was early into my second semester. So, and Paul White and I decided to take the CBS job, and Paul White wanted me to start to work early, which would be to divide my time as a student with my work at Columbia Journalism and my work at CBS, which made a lot of sense, because part of what you were doing in school was actually field work. And of course my field work was real then when I started in April of that year.
Scheduled for June graduation, were you?
Scheduled for June graduation, but I started in April, and I was able to work on a show and still do my assignments. White was the major faculty member then, and he could arrange arrangements for all these things. And I was assigned to write for Bob Trout, who was a very well-known CBS reporter, broadcast reporter at that time. And it was a great assignment because I, as a sort of radio junkie in my growing up period, had always listened to Bob Trout as he talked about conventions, as he talked about all kinds of things. He was, he is a fantastic wordsmith. He can draw your, he can give you the pictures without television. Better, they're much better when he gives them to you in words, actually, than when you actually see it. It isn't nearly as interesting. He was a perfect person to work with. He was, we got along. He had a wonderful sense of humor, and he also was very helpful. He would pretty well read anything I wrote for him, but I'd know when he didn't think it was that great.
So you went there as a radio writer.
I was a radio writer.
And how many people were in that had that assignment when you were there?
Well, there were.
Roughly, right.
I was the only one working with Bob. He and I worked together on his program that was a 15-minute program on radio every afternoon, Monday through Friday. In the newsroom at CBS at that time, it's hard for me to, 12 to 20 all told for all shifts, probably. This does not count your analysts like Quincy Howe, who was there. William L. Shirer came later. Actually, he came probably in 44, I think. And you had a radio documentary type program. Not documentary, it was a weekly half-hour program that was going on, and they had a producer there. They had little offices along the side of the newsroom, but the newsroom itself was not very large. You had every wire coming in there that there was, Reuters and shortwave and INS, UP, AP, everything was into this newsroom. It was just a hub of great activity. And reporters, you had most of your major CBS reporters, journalists, overseas at that time.
Including Murrow.
Of course, Murrow was the head of the whole crowd over in...
And Severide.
Murrow, Severide, Howard K. Smith, Charles Collingwood, Winston Burdett, Richard Hotelet, Bill Downs, George Polk, who was in Greece. It was the star-studded crowd who have made the history of broadcast journalism.
How many women were there in that group?
Well, there was one other woman who had been hired by Paul White out of the School of Journalism too, named Peg Miller, who in later years became Peg White. And she was writing for this weekly half-hour program. There was one other girl. I don't know where she came from. She was a writer. Beth, her name was. And then on down the line, a few months after school, after graduation from the School of Journalism, another girl from my class was hired. But that was it. Of the people working there in any kind of writing or journalistic, actually practicing journalism, there weren't many.
When did Ed Murrow come into your life and the life of CBS News, I guess, in New York?
Well, he came back after the war. He came back in about, I guess, late 1945. And he was on the air, and then he became an executive in charge of news and public affairs. And he was very much in my life at that point because I, through this period of time, had taken over a broadcast that Bob Trout had started called Feature Story, which was giving assignments to the correspondents and doing a companion piece from New York. I did that. I reported it and wrote it, did not air it because a woman's voice was going to be too squeaky for broadcast in those days. In this country, there were other countries. I think in England there were women broadcasting, but not in this country, goodness. Anyway, so there was a voice for me. and I also was a producer of this broadcast that had assignments out for all the different correspondents, and Ed Murrow became my boss for that whole thing, and I did deal with him a lot.
For how many years now would you say you were working with him there?
Well, he came back, and he was my boss, and it was very close. And gradually, all the correspondents came back, and there were the parties. And I mean, journalists are a good, happy crowd. They like to do a lot of celebrating, and there were so many things to celebrate in those days. As the war came to an end, as all kinds of things happened, and we were working together, and Murrow was part of the crowd. We'd go out to parties, everybody, together, and I would, at that time, you could do what I did, which would be call up Murrow, and I'd say, I'm just all mixed up about whatever this was I was mixed up about. And he'd say, well, let's go have lunch. And so you go have lunch, and you'd talk and try to get unmixed up, And he was great for that, because he was just as strong and conscientious a thinker as a friend as he projected he was on the air.
What's your most vivid memory of him, if you had to think about one memory of him or one particular time?
Well, of course, he did good things for me. He assigned me, when Feature Story went down, he assigned me to be on the original 4-person documentary unit for CBS, things such as that. There were 2 things that I remember because I've carried them as lessons sort of through my life. One of them was when I had my program all arranged, Feature Story, which had a theme every day, and it meant working with correspondents far away, or reporters in this country at that time. Had the show all set when Bill Downs, one of the correspondents, came up with a story that he had just gotten that he said was so moving and so important. He'd been to a veterans hospital, that he just had to get it on the air. Well, Feature Story was basically a correspondence show. And so Bill wanted to go on Feature Story, and I said, no, I can't do that today. We'll do it tomorrow because I'm all set. And we got Collingwood, we got all these folks that are coming on. And Bill was not one who, when he felt strongly about anything, to take no for an answer, and he went up to Murrow. And Murrow called me and said, Ruth, I know you're all set. He was never harsh. I never heard him just bark a command, but he got what he wanted by the way he performed. And he said, but I have learned through the years, if Bill Downs is excited about something, you better make a place for it on the air because it's going to be worth it. I thought of that in subsequent times about bosses who don't trust their talent to come up with ideas, or they don't know that when that person is excited about something, it's going to be worth something. That was a very important time. I'm trying to think of the other one was when I came back from my first documentary, which had been on the peaceful side, the peaceful uses of atomic science. And I worked with the Atomic Energy Commission at that time, and the old remnants of the Manhattan Project from which the atomic bomb emerged were still around, General Groves. And I had also worked with Einstein, and I'd been around talking with Oppenheimer and all these people around the country, and I was very full of this whole story of atomic science. And one of the producers in the documentary unit, who was sort of our mentor and the one who prescribed how we would produce our stories when we came back with our documentary, wanted to do it as kind of a fantasy. Alice in Wonderland goes tromping through these places, because so much of what the promise was for the future. And I said, that is trivializing this tremendously important, world-shaking story that is atomic science, atomic energy. And I remember Murrow agreeing with me, and again, with somebody having a feeling about something, that I can see how Ruth feels. She's put all this into this. She knows what the feeling is and how important it is. And she shouldn't have to see it trivialized. So he stuck with me in that case. And again, there was this person who could feel when you genuinely cared about your work, and he was back of you when you genuinely cared about your work. It's a lesson that I wish somebody could teach to people who are in charge these days in many, many news organizations.
Doing a lot of work and not being able to put it on the air yourself. Was there ever a point at which you said, I want to go on the air?
No, no. It was not in your thoughts because nobody did it. I mean, if there had been other women on, I probably would have been agitating, but there weren't any other women that were visible at that time on the air. However, it came up. I'll tell you about how it came up. They came up. For one thing, it was senseless. If you think of this person who was my voice on feature story, for instance, there would be times when we'd be covering special events. And I would have to, we'd go down and here come the tanks rumbling down Fifth Avenue, followed by the general who's being celebrated. And I would have to, with a typewriter, a portable typewriter, type out every word. Now it was radio, so you couldn't see. There was a little lag time sometimes. I would type out every description of everything that was happening on Fifth Avenue or wherever we happened to be covering this story and pass over the papers to Harry, who would then read it. And it really was very inefficient. So they finally decided to put the words where the mouth and the words together. At least try it. And they had some auditions at CBS for.
This is about what year now we're talking about?
Oh, we're talking about like 1947, something like that. And so they chose 3 of us to audition.
3 women.
3 women to audition, and my boss still was, one of the bosses was still Paul White, who was the boss of the newsroom at CBS. Murrow was overall upstairs at that, right in that era. He subsequently came back downstairs and did a show, but he was upstairs. But White had, now this is a nice historical document you are creating here, but I will confess that it had been discovered that after hours, if I had a couple of beers, my voice got lower.
And you'd done a lot of research on
And I had done some research into voice. And my boss knew that. And so before the audition, he took me down to the downstairs bistro and ordered a beer for me, which turned, and this is a true story, it turned out to be flat. Just about the way I was on the audition, but so were the others. So there still were no women on the
so
air.
none of you succeeded at that
None of
audition.
us succeeded.
No.
Beer, no, nothing, nothing helped. It took a while before women were on the air.
So how did you get on the air? Or did you get on the air in New York?
I didn't get on the air in New York. And I didn't miss it because there were, as I say, had there been women on the air, I'm sure every other woman who was working behind the scenes would have wanted to be on the air. And there weren't many of us behind the scenes either. Women just weren't doing a whole lot at that point in the major news organizations. They still weren't doing a lot at all in the newspapers, in print journalism either. I know I was so pleased when finally you began to see bylines for women at the Los Angeles Times. And I don't remember ever seeing one at that particular time in the New York Times. But it was not until I came back to Los Angeles, and ultimately they put on a news program in Los Angeles on the CBS television station. And with television brand new in 1951, they didn't figure they had much to lose. So they took a chance, and that's where I started.
This was a contact. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Onward and upward.
How did you find out about the job in Los Angeles?
Somebody called me up, a person who was the news director for KNX, because when I came back to Los Angeles, which had been my aim all along, in an autobiography when I was first in journalism school in New York, I had written, I was born and raised in Southern California. I hope to live, work, and die in Southern California. Well, that was pretty dramatic, but it took me a while to make that, that transition, but I did come back in '49 and worked at KNX, and then I left I had gotten married, and I left for, not maternity leave. They didn't give you maternity leave. When you were going to have a baby in those days, you quit. In fact, I asked him to fire me, because then I could get severance, you know, something, because there was no understanding. I mean, a woman had a baby, that was her fault, and she had to go home and quit her job, which I did do. And I came back on the job, though, when the head of KNX News called and said, at that point, television was just a little shoestring. But CBS was going to go on the air with this television station and had been playing around with it, and they wanted to start a real live news program, half-hour news program at 10 o'clock at night.
So it was KNX, which was CBS,
Right.
and then KNXT, which was also CBS.
Well,
so
it was not KNXT. I think it was called KTSL at that time. It was only a short while later that they went to KNXT, as they call letters. But the news director called me up and said, we're going to put together this half-hour show, and we want to do it in segments. And we'll have somebody do hard news, somebody do sports, somebody do local news. We'd like to have you do the woman's angle. And then they had somebody doing analysis. And fine. And what I interpreted to be the woman's angle was anything I wanted to do, because I was a woman, and that's the way I played it. And I did fashions maybe once or twice in my life. But otherwise, I did consumer things. I did events happening around town. I did whatever I felt like doing that I thought was a good story that would be in the feature area, basically, but it was not. It was what I thought was a good story. So that's it. It was very successful.
Were you on the air in radio at KNX Radio?
Not at that time.
Not at that
I
time.
started first on television. And
So your first on-air work really was television?
my first on-the-air work was on television, starting in October 1951. And it was on this program with this bunch of guys. And it was a lot of fun. We didn't have pictures. We had whatever we brought into the studio. People. I did interviews. Props. They could be pretty interesting at times.
There was a particularly interesting prop.
Well, I
think
did
you
a
told me about.
story. I did a story about an air show. And the people who were promoting the air show had a lot of little model airplanes of the airplanes that were going to be shown at the air show. And so I surrounded myself with all these airplanes. Well, it turned out to be kind of a comedy, because by the time I got through with all of these airplanes, 100 airplanes around me, I couldn't tell a B-17 from a P-38 or whatever they were flying in those days. And so it was not my most successful story. But when we were started then with this program, and it was doing well, KNX top management decided, say, they've got this woman on the air over at Channel 2, let's audition for a woman on radio. So they had auditions, and I just auditioned for that, and I won those auditions. So I got a spot on radio, too, so that I did a 15-minute daily news program on KNX, and then my little spot at night on KNXT, which by that time it was, which was a lot.
Describe a typical day at this time in your life.
It was pretty murderous, because I would, one thing about it, if you're preparing for one news program, out of that you may find a story that's going to be all right and that you're going to use for the nighttime show on television, which I did from time to time. However, with radio, I had to be in early and I was married with a child at that point. I had to be in early to go through wires, to go out on stories, to go out and talk to people.
So by early, what do you mean?
Oh, what, 9? That would be early, or 8 maybe. But then I would do the show, as I recall, it was between 1 and 2 in the afternoon. Then I would get things in shape for the night program, which would be on at 10, and I would have to do a certain amount of preparation for that, so it would be set to go when I finally came back. Then I would go home at maybe 5 o'clock and put up my hair, bearing in mind that right away you find out that whatever you say is second to how you look if you're a woman, and your hair is the most important thing that you have going for you or against you. So you put up your hair, and you have dinner, and you take care of the family, and put your baby to bed, and get back to the station by 9, and do a show at 10, and then get home by 11, 11:30, get up and try it all over again. And at that point, we were doing how many days a week? I think we were doing 6 days a week on television. I ultimately had somebody who came in and did my Sunday program, which was a number of months down the line. But anyway, that's
so
where
for how many years did you have this sort of
I
killing
only
schedule?
went on television. I continued television for a good part of a year, but I realized it was too much, and I would have to quit something. And considering that nighttime was hard time, although it was best for your career, better for your career than the daytime, if I were a real career-driven person, I would have stayed on at night. And I certainly would in view of what the circumstances were, because I had just been sold nationally to Maxwell House Coffee. And great big presentations had been made up, and it was the biggest thing that was going on around our place, because television was new, and we had this national account, and it was very important. But I made up my mind that I was going to only work on the daytime show on radio, and I had to give up television at night, which shows that it takes a long time to get sophisticated and bright. It took me a long time anyway, because you just wouldn't do that. You wouldn't give up this big opportunity if you had any career sense at all. However, I decided I couldn't work at night anymore, and on the way to the presentation involving all CBS and Maxwell House Coffee and the ad agency, I told the account executive for CBS that I had decided not to work on television anymore.
I think you'd have to explain a little bit that you've been sold to Maxwell House Coffee. I'm not sure everybody would understand that.
I was to be sponsored by Maxwell House Coffee, and I was to do the commercials. This was pretty radical in itself, and I think because I was a woman, now, you know, women do they were doing commercials at that point. So, but anyway, I was supposed to do commercials for Maxwell House Coffee, and they would be paying for my segment on television news. And I, at that particular time, decided not to continue on television news, which meant that whole account blew right out the window, and it did not make me the favorite of the sales department.
So
But I continued on radio.
you continued on radio for how long now, just doing radio?
I continued on radio till about 1958.
And you had a second daughter.
I had a second daughter in the course of all that time.
And so you were just doing radio until 58.
58. It was radio, though, that was on the Western Network, which was 47 stations. So that was a lot. And it was a good job, very good job.
And fairly regular hours.
Well, yes, it was. You had to do the program several times in order to get it to all the stations at different time zones, different times that they could accept it. And so you had to sort of update it, but it was a short program. It started out 5 minutes, then I did a 10-minute program called The Ruth Ashton Show at one time, and The Woman's News Desk at another time. And it would not be on until early. It would be on in the afternoon, different times of the afternoon. So it was not a bad job. It was a very good job.
You would have guests?
I would go out. I went out with a tape recorder. I was in the field a lot. I actually, with radio, was able to get out and report a lot more than I could with television, because we did not have cameras going with us at that time in the early days.
One or two of your favorite stories you did then, do you remember?
On radio? I don't remember a thing. I did fires.
Does it all just kind of flow together?
It was, I think we're talking like history, because we're talking in the 50s, and it was, I think, a situation that happens to reporters who are covering, and I was doing the whole front page, which I'd start out with in terms of what was breaking for the day, and then I would go out and cover the news. Now, I do recall, as I said, among important stories that I enjoyed doing were space stories, because it was during a program, I was on the air at the time, that we got the bulletin that Sputnik had been put into orbit by the Soviet Union. And what in the heck is a Sputnik, you know? And I'm on the air when they hand me the bulletin, but once you sort of bat it around and you don't know, you're certainly going to know by the time you do the program the next day. And we, of course, were struggling in this country to get our space program going, and I spent a great deal of time at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and where a lot of the work was going on, and certainly a lot of the tracking of Sputnik was going on, and where we had, they kept me up and they explained, even though a lot of the work was other places, we'd always have the experts out at the JPL. And of course, as that went on too, the JPL became so important in putting up the probes to the moon, ultimately the spacecraft into outer orbit, into up to Mars. I mean, there were so many things that happened at JPL. So that those were among favorite stories of mine.
Mm-hmm.
Also, of course, a lot was happening with Israel at that time, and I was doing a great deal with a lot of people who were involved with the Israelis and trying to help get that democracy going. A lot also was happening in the arts. I can remember doing things with Saul Hurok, who was getting some acts to the Soviet Union, things like that. It was always exciting, because if you were on the air at that time with so much going on, it wasn't such a crowded field as it is now, so that you could look around and people would come to you because there weren't that huge crowd of talk shows and news shows to go to. Mm-hmm. And that was fun, because we were doing things that hadn't ever been done before. Everything that was done for the first time we were able to get a part of.
How did you get connected with Pat Buttram, and how did that happen?
Well, Pat Buttram, in the 60s, I was on a radio show that went on all day long, and not all day long, all afternoon, from 12:30 to 5. And we did feature stories. We did one long segment, an hour show in the middle of that. But for the most part, it was feature stories with 2 or 3 of us doing those stories. And Pat Buttram was kind of our comic relief. He had been the sidekick to Gene Autry, and very funny man. And he would just sit back and kibitz with us. And he also, his only organized thing was a household hints section. And he was really very funny trying to give household hints. People would write him and he would tell them how to wash their windows, and always complete farce. And the management decided to make a show out of Pat's household hints. And they had wanted me to work with him on a 15-minute program where we would have call-ins, and we would take one household hint a day and invite our audience to call in their suggestions. Pat, of course, would do what he does, which is be totally outrageous, and barely on the right side of the blue line sometimes. But anyway, funny, very funny. And we went on for a 15-minute program called the Ruth and Pat Show, which annoyed him terribly. He thought it should be the Pat and Ruth Show, but it was the Ruth and Pat Show. And we did one household hint a day. How do you keep onions from making your refrigerator not smell so good? Or what do you do about coat hangers? I mean, deep studies like that. People would call in, and he would bat them back, and I was the straight person. Anyway, that was the Pat Ruth Show. This was not, I would say, the highlight of my journalistic career, but it was a highlight.
It was involved you in sponsorship too, weren't you involved at that point? Who sponsored that?
I don't remember who sponsored that. There were always, at that point we had a lot of joint sponsors. We had more spots. In the early days of radio and television, you had actual sponsors who would sponsor a program. And
there's a picture of you with a coffee can.
Oh, well, that coffee can was in the 50s. I didn't, Maxwell House Coffee and I didn't make it because I quit television, but subsequently, ironically almost, I was sponsored by Hills Brothers Coffee to start with, and then by Folgers Coffee, which was sort of like betrayal, because Hills and Folgers hated each other. They were both big coffee companies in San Francisco. but I didn't do them both at the same time, so I guess maybe I've been forgiven.
In 1958, then you moved
Well,
into television?
No,
No?
I stayed with radio.
I
And that's the Ruth and Pat show happened in the 60s, and the storyline in the 60s, which was the long feature show. And I didn't move to television. I moved back to television in 1966.
All right. So
Yeah.
you went back 1958 now. We had you in 1958, and I'm confused here.
Well, you
1958.
asked me about the Ruth and Pat, and I
Right.
jumped over to the
I did that.
60s. You see, if
Okay.
you're dealing with a
My
century,
fault,
you've got
right.
a lot of decades to play with.
Get me out of the 50s then.
So get me out of them.
Please.
I actually, there were a lot of program changes, and I'm not going to go into the fact that I periodically would be fairly temperamental and would quit, and happily nobody would
go
let me.
into it, Ruth. You got to talk about quitting.
Happily nobody let me, but one time they did, and I did quit at the end of the 50s and was permitted to do that. I worked for a couple of years at the Claremont colleges doing some publicity, actually getting some of their people on television, working up a whole show, did a movie, a lot of things for the colleges, but academic life is not for me. It is, excuse me, I'm discussing this with somebody from the academic world, but I think it's slow. And so I was happy to get back to where I belonged in this rat race, and did in the 60s. And
Where you could quit again, is it?
I quit quite a lot, but they
If
didn't
you had
let
to add
me.
up all the times you quit, Ruth, how many times do you think you've quit?
I don't want to talk about that. But it gave itself to some good lunches from time to time. In fact, I was asked by some producers, would you please quit today? Because I haven't had a good lunch with the boss for a long time. We have to go out and figure out what's wrong and why you should not. And but I don't think things are like that anymore. I don't know if I were in the business at full steam these days that I would quit quite so often if I cared about the paycheck. But I was taught in journalism school, very important lesson, to always have a go to hell fund, because if you're in journalism, you're not going to like it a lot of times, and you should, if you're going to keep your own conscience, you got to be ready to say go to hell. And I have.
Okay, no, we're in the 60s. We got there now.
We got there.